And welcome to the post-election vlog for Old North State politics. I'm Michael Bitzer of Catawba College, and I am once again pleased to welcome my distinguished colleagues and friends who have made it through election 2020 with me. I know it's barely there, but we have made it, and we are on the other side, and we'll see what plays out here over the next couple of weeks. But this is just kind of in the vein of our pre-election vlog, just a spontaneous, off the cuff, here's what we're thinking about from both the big level and maybe down into the micro level of what election 2020 has brought us. I think we're all still kind of digesting things and thinking about things and waiting for data to come out. But I dare say we all have something to focus on. So Susan Roberts from Davidson, start us off.
Well, I like crime shows, and when they bring the murder victim in and the coroner says, looks like blunt force trauma, but I can't tell until I do an autopsy. Well, that's the way I am about the election right now. I haven't been getting kind of granular, but I think, what happened, looking at the votes, looking at the turnout, and looking at the pandemic. And I think we'll all agree that the turnout was amazing. Yeah. And it was, I only wish that were an indicator of the health of our democracy. Sometimes I think that may not be what we see, because we see people that came out to vote against. When I looked at, in terms of the turnout, a friend called me Saturday morning. I was up trying to pay attention to my day job, i.e. Saturday morning grading papers. And she called, and she was in New York, and she said, oh, there are horns honking and people dancing in the streets. And I said, I'm in Davis and I see nothing. But I think it was one of those things in which we had waited so long, all of us, I'm sure, that I wasn't going to be glued to the television on Saturday morning. But I think if I were to take away anything, will turnout be an indicator of the health of the democracy? And I'm not sure that it will. I think it was more a show against Trump, and people were mobilized and motivated by voting against Trump. But I'm not sure there was that enthusiasm for Biden that will, I think it'll wear thin in the next 2 years. I just don't think it'll carry us for the next 4 years.
Yeah, I think, with some of the national estimates I've seen, this could be the highest turnout since 1900. According to the State Board of Elections here in North Carolina, 75.22% of the 7.3 million registered voters in the state cast a ballot. That's 5.5 million. Chris, what do you think about this turnout phenomenon, and if it can be sustained?
I'll copy that 1 second. I will say at the beginning, you said we made it through the election. I'd like to tell anybody watching that 30 seconds before we started recording, Michael talked about how he was hitting refresh to see who was up in the North Carolina State Supreme Court justice race. So maybe we're not quite through the door yet, right? Maybe we're still just at the tail end of it. But it's a great question on turnout. I mean, the way I'm looking at this election, with all the caveats that Susan put out there, we don't know the granular level data yet. The voter history file is not out. All of those things. I'm thinking of it, particularly in North Carolina, is one where the inputs changed a lot, but the outputs came out pretty similarly. So what I mean by that is, as Susan articulated better than I will, turnout, when you just did as well, Michael, turnout is way up. We're looking at 3 in every 4 registered voters that came out. We radically changed the way people voted. Absentee by mail went from around about 4% of the votes cast to just shy of 1 in every 5 votes cast. Election day voting went to the 3rd most popular of the 3 ways you can cast a vote in North Carolina. And the types of people and the types of voters that took each of those options also changed dramatically, right? So all the inputs, at least in our state, were very, very different. And what's remarkable to me, though, is the output stayed the same, right? So remember back a few months ago when the world looked so different, and we had a Democratic governor in North Carolina, 2 Republican senators, one of whom was elected narrowly. We had a Republican-controlled General Assembly, but not a supermajority. We had Republican-controlled congressional delegation, but but obviously not as much of one as we've had in the past. Well, that looks a lot like kind of the way we ended up, right? So the inputs change, the outputs stayed remarkably similar, and at least at that point, that's the big takeaway message for me.
Whitney, what do you think about turnout?
I think it's fantastic that so many Americans turned out. And I love the fact that North Carolina got to 75%. That's such a great number that I can use in class now. But I'm with Susan on fearing that it doesn't necessarily mean positive things for or a positive sign of the health of our democracy. Before we got on this vlog, I was joking about how I was going to come on and trash the Electoral College. And I was joking, but then Michael
Now's
sent
your
an
chance.
article, right, from the New York Times, and I was like, yes, they're right. The Electoral College is stupid in 2020. Thanks, Jamel Bowie. And I think that how Americans feel about this, hearing that so many of us turned out, and yet we're still beholden to these old institutions and how they go, and to hear that so many members of one party are fine with ignoring the will of so many people who turned out is just not very good news for me as a political scientist thinking about the health of our democracy.
I want to pick up on that. The certainly the health or the infirmity of our democracy can be certainly debated, and we can discuss that probably in an entire separate vlog. But the issue of the Electoral College that you brought up and the institutional structure, what do you think if we did away with the Electoral College and went to a straight popular vote? Do you think that turnout would be impacted, affected in some way if that was the new standard, the new norm of electing president, vice president?
I do think that it would change where people turn out, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So my best example of this is the state of Texas in this election. When I was growing up there and spent most of my life there, no one bothered to vote. It actually was the literal lowest turnout in the United States, because we just told all the time that your vote doesn't matter. It's going to go red. There's a million Electoral College votes, but it doesn't really matter. And then Texas gets told it's a swing state, and they have the highest turnout they've ever had. And they busted through all kinds of records. And so I really do think that really changed how a lot of Texans approached this election. And I can tell the difference just in my own experience, and it's an anecdote, but I moved from Texas to North Carolina, and it was a sea change for me being in a swing state. And how people talked about politics and who participated, it was just very different. And so I think one of the arguments I hear a lot about the Electoral College is that it will just mean that voter or candidates pay attention to the big cities. But all the Electoral College does is make sure that candidates pay attention to the swing states. So it's not that different. And at the end of the day, people vote, not land. And so I think that if we switched from the Electoral College to a pure popular vote system, I don't know that in the end the total number of turnout changes, but who turns out, I think definitely would.
Can I just say one thing, Michael, real quickly?
Yeah, chime in, Susan.
Reading the Federalist Papers, people have made the argument that the Electoral College would save us from having a demagogue. And, many people accuse Trump of being an authoritarian, a demagogue. And so clearly the Electoral College wasn't the circuit breaker in that election.
Yeah, okay. Chris, what are you taking away as kind of the big picture in terms of how you're looking at 2020?
Really, to me, it's kind of stability on the outcomes and the outputs, but it changes in the inputs. And I'm glad Whitney's drawing our attention to these institutions that are governing so much of the outputs that we do see, right? Why are we seeing such remarkable stability despite some things that change on the front end? One, hyperpartisanship, and I think we all experience that in formal and in informal ways. but also the structures that we have move us towards those outcomes, that they're not separate. So I hope Americans will pay more attention to the structure of government. The Electoral College is what you talked about. Obviously, we're all of a sudden having conversations about the size of the U.S. Supreme Court and why it's set the way it is, and whether the U.S. Senate is set up to guarantee rights of folks from small states or to diminish the votes of people from large states. All of us have turned our eyes onto the state of Georgia in the last week or so. And I think it's worth remembering that if Georgia didn't have these antiquated runoff rules that came out of a one-party South, we wouldn't be having any conversation about Georgia. We wouldn't be redoing these things. In my own home district of the 11th Congressional District in North Carolina, this guy Madison Cawthorn, right, is going to end up being he won and he's going to represent us going forward. He lost the first primary. We're only having member of Congress Cawthorn because North Carolina still has runoff rules. So I think we should all be paying a lot more attention to these institutional rules that we have and realize that just like we got rid of an indirect election of senators, just like we got rid of one member of Congress for every 30,000 people, we too can change all these electoral processes that we just mentioned.
And I actually am teaching my students about that. So I've shifted my whole intro to American politics class to be a focus on the Constitution and why did they write it the way that they did? And do we still have to be stuck with this? Whenever you consider that the US Constitution is mostly cobbled together through compromises that were politically expedient in 1789, like why do 2020 people need to be beholden to them? So I'm actually holding a constitutional convention in my class next week. And I had all the students submit amendments. And at least 3 of them have submitted to abolish the Electoral College.
Really?
But also, funnily enough, several of them want to lower the voting age because they don't like the fact that so many older Americans, they feel, are controlling their vote. Now, of course, I pointed out, like, you could fix this by turning out your cells. But some of them want to lower the voting age to 16. So I'm really excited to see where they take the Constitutional Convention. But to Chris's point, like, I'm trying to just mostly make them aware of the fact that these are things that can change if there's enough Americans that want them to.
I'm curious as to how your students react when you talk about this, before they hold their convention. What's been their reaction to actually diving into and trying to understand the rules of the game?
I mean, mostly they just think that it all sounds very unfair. And that's what I actually talked about this, I think, in our last vlog, where I said that I've gotten a general sense of unease with our political system since Trump won in 2016 that I'm not sure went away. And it could be because I do spend a lot of time with 18 to 22-year-olds like you all do. And I'm reading what they're thinking. But I just, in the years that I've been teaching, I've gotten a sense that the Gen Z feels a lot more radical about things than the older generations. And they're more willing to look at what could we do to make things feel fair. And so even as I'm describing, like, why we have these different institutions in place and why they were established, and this is pros and cons of each thing, just overall, there's a sense of disquiet among my students about how they feel like the system isn't set up to really listen to American citizens, and that bothers them. And so they've been raised their whole life like they need to be fair and just and include everyone. And so why doesn't our system fair and just and include everyone?
And can I piggyback on that just a second?
Yeah.
I think that when we look at 2 things, a lot of times people go, what? You can't register to vote until when? They don't count the votes in Pennsylvania until Election Day. I think people are waking up to the fact that there's a patchwork quilt of laws regulating elections everywhere in the country. Just like sometimes people say, well, if they overturn Roe versus Wade, then abortion will be ended, or these sorts of questions. So I think that's one issue, finally realizing that there are things, there's a subtext. And then also, sometimes young people want to get involved, but they're so willing to kind of like let's raise money for this project. Let's go out and do that. That's, the kind of engaged citizenship that doesn't necessarily include voting. So I'm happy to hear that the students are saying, okay, let's wake up. We don't vote, we need to. That's the way you change, not hearts and minds necessarily. It's the ballot box.
Yeah.
But it's hard to motivate them to vote if they feel like it doesn't matter, because the Electoral College is just going to put in whoever the Electoral College wants, especially if state legislatures just choose all new electors, which is not likely, to be clear, but it's still concerning that it's possible.
And just having that conversation, I mean, just having that, possibility float out there. If Pennsylvania's legislature could override the popular vote in the state, could Wisconsin, could Michigan, that kind of tinkering with the rules of the game while you're playing the game is something I think that I've done the same approach you've done, Whitney, and last semester when I taught our intro to American politics, I had them read the Constitution and we went through it. That was the framework that I structured the class around. And, for them, it was an interesting dynamic of, okay, I didn't realize all of these little things are in there, but at the same time, they were thinking, God, how vague could this language be to where you could tinker with the rules of the game in the middle of the game? Chris, I don't know if you've had a similar experience with your students in that regard.
I have much, and a couple things real quick. One, the voting, Whitney, you gave me the perfect introduction to pimp one of my colleagues. So my friend Niall Michelson in our department just completed his book, Votes at 16, that makes the exact argument that you're talking about, Whitney. So he makes the argument in here. It's fairly brief, so you can actually get through it. And makes the argument for why we should reduce the voting age to 16. Pick up Niall's book if you can. He's a nice guy, smart guy. And then on the Constitution piece, and kind of picking up with Susan's patchwork notion, I think we should be having these conversations about the federal Constitution. We also need to be having these conversations about our state constitutions, right? For whatever reason, Americans are much more comfortable changing our state constitutions than we are our federal constitutions, right? We're on round 3 of North Carolina state constitutions. It seems like if you tell Americans, hey, we're going to have a constitutional convention for the whole country, they lose their minds. If you say you can have one for the state, well, we've done some of those as recently as the 1980s. And of course, it's the state rules that are, as Susan pointed out, really what's driving elections in America. So I think we need to be having these conversations about federal election laws and federal structures. And we also need to be thinking about our state constitution. And just sort of in closing on that, we've got one thing in the North Carolina Constitution that never ceases to amaze and disgust me, which is we still have a literacy test that is written into our state constitution. And we had the option to get rid of it when we rewrote the Constitution in the early 1970s. North Carolinians voted for all these different amendments. The one we voted against was getting rid of the literacy test. So I think there are changes that we can make that Americans might be more willing to accept, and those tend to be at the state level.
Yeah. And just to clarify, that's dead letter law. I mean, that is not applicable in today's context.
It is not applicable. It is, you're right. It would be a symbolic move to get rid of it. My argument is it's an important symbol, but you're absolutely
right. Most definitely. Yeah. Most definitely.
Well, and speaking of Michael, you posed the question of like, if we move to a pure popular vote system, what would that look like? I actually tell people that I think the more likely thing to do would be to change it state by state, as Chris is talking about, where, some states have decided to join the National Popular Vote Compact. I think Colorado just voted to join it in this election cycle. But there's also, the way that states could choose to apportion their electors like Nebraska and Maine do, which I believe political science research has shown that it wouldn't actually be any more fair than the Electoral College. But I think any of those things are much more likely to happen than totally abolishing the Electoral College. Because states do have more say here and it feels less scary, like Chris was talking about, to Americans.
Yeah. Great points. Whitney, what's your big takeaway?
I think the thing that I've been paying attention to, and again, it could be my Texas roots and it could be because I'm married to a Mexican, but I was paying attention to the Latino vote. and the turnout there, and how along the Rio Grande Valley there were crazy swings from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. And it kind of dovetails with some of my own research that I've done into Gen Z political attitudes, where we find that white Gen Z boys are more conservative than their previous generations. And we're also increasingly seeing that Latino Gen Z men are also conservative like white men. And so I was really interested to see that result out of this election, because it seems to be confirming that idea that Gen Z is not actually as liberal as everyone keeps saying that it is, at least in some pockets of the demographics. And so I'll be interested to see, as more information comes out via exit polls and analysis of the voter files, what exactly is happening there with the Latino vote in the United States, because for a long time, the Democratic Party has been thinking of them as, the next Black vote. As soon as they get enough Latinos who can vote, that they will have that group locked down. And it appears from this election that they don't.
What, any hypotheses, any educated guesses that you want to take to kind of, because I noticed that too. I'm teaching Southern politics, and we ended election day with Florida and Texas. And, trying to explain that borderline county area, but then the flip, any sense of what might be going on there?
Well, I will just jump in. I think that one of the things that that Whitney says is, this wasn't an election with the economy and COVID. It wasn't an election that access to abortion could really move up the agenda ladder. But that's something that I think Democrats take for granted, that they're the party of Hispanic, Latinx, and forget about the importance of abortion to that group, to the Catholic segment of that group. And I think that we were mistaken to think that all Latinx, their primary issue is immigration. It's not, it's jobs, the economy, education. But abortion is still there as a subtext in that vote. And I think that's something we've got to note, that there are other things going on besides just we're the party of that supports immigration. There are other factors with that Gen Z vote. And I don't think you can actually assume that younger voters are necessarily going to favor access to abortion by and large, but you can't assume that about all ethnic and demographic groups.
Well, and I need to make a caveat here too. Susan is absolutely right, that there are pockets within the Latino vote that can go one way or another, and especially because there's really no such thing as the Latino vote. There's the Mexican vote and the Puerto Rican vote and the Cuban vote, and insert other Latino group here that Americans all smush together into this one voting block. But they don't consider themselves that way, and we shouldn't either. They are very different and have different concerns from group to group.
I'm going to annoyingly pop in another pitch for a colleague's book. So one of my historian friends, Ben Francis Fallon here at Western Carolina, has a book called The Latino Vote that makes a lot of the same argument, that the notion of the Latino vote as this monolith that of course doesn't exist, as Whitney articulated very well, is a social construction and a political construction. So he traces, I think, really, really well kind of how that happened and how the creation of this political notion of a Latino vote came about. So anybody who's interested in that story, put it on your Christmas book list.
Speaking of other demographic groups, I mean, what as we get more data, and particularly, a massive survey that we political scientists, kind of commonly refer to often, the American National Election Studies, potentially the AP's VoteCast survey, which I think started in 2018. They've released that data. Hopefully they'll release this year's data. It's another massive survey of voters. Susan, demographics, what might you be looking at and thinking about when it comes to helping to explain this year's election?
The one that is only interesting in terms of turnout is the African-American vote. There may be questions about, okay, we voted for you, the African-American community. How are you going to consider us? We have some things we want you to look at in the future. And then we look at the suburban woman vote. And that was one, and I wish I could take, and we look across the board, there was turnout. Suburban women and women have endured, you could say, a full term or almost full term of the Trump presidency. And one of my students was giving a presentation actually about Arizona as a battleground state. And the title of one of the slides was Suburban Women, Grab Him by the Ballot. And I thought that really said a lot to me about what happened in terms of motivating women, motivating suburban women. And they didn't like the continued references to suburban housewife, sexual innuendo, and to make them feel as if they were housewives who felt their neighborhoods were being invaded. And although these suburban women did think law and order and justice was an issue, they didn't see it in their neighborhood. And so I think those two demographics, one, the African-American demographic did not surprise us. The women did not surprise us, but I think looking at the motivation, and I think if we looked, and you guys can speak to this better than I, but the one thing, if you looked to me and looking at all the vote cast, is the urban-rural divide is alive and very well.
Yep, I think all of us agree with that dynamic playing out. Chris, I know you're interested in that as well. What demographic group are you thinking about in terms of trying to focus in on explaining this year?
You know, I mean, all those things. I mean, I think Whitney's point on the Latino vote is such a good one. I think what Susan's talking about is really smart. And I think on this urban rural thing, just to put a couple of points on it. So just in North Carolina, and again, with all the caveats of we don't know everything, all the ballots aren't counted, having it refresh in the last few seconds on the Board of Elections website, as Professor Bitzer does. It looks like Trump's margin increased in rural counties and of course decreased in urban and suburban counties. So we already had the split, right? Of course, if you're watching this, you must care a little bit about politics. And therefore you of course know that rural areas are more likely to go to Trump in 2016, urban more likely to go Democrat, and then suburban are kind of this battleground. Well, those differences grew in 2020. Trump's vote share in North Carolina grew. He got better. He got more popular, if you will, in rural areas. He got less popular in the areas where he already was not as popular. And so I think that's one thing I'm going to be watching. And there's this interesting footnote, to me anyway, on the North Carolina data. The one place that doesn't appear to be true on this rural piece is Western North Carolina. And I'm not really sure why yet, to be frank. We're still just obviously a few days after the election. But that's something I want to be watching as well, because I've been moving from the assumption that the traditional three-part regional divide of our state is gone, and that really it's about urban and rural and suburban. And maybe there's something else happening there that I'm not sure. Maybe there's a way those two things are interacting that I haven't thought about before.
Cool. Whitney, in terms of beyond Gen Z and Latinx dynamics, anything in particular that you're thinking about, or maybe something that the Meredith poll might be considering going into the future, trying to dissect and understand things?
Well, we're definitely going to continue our study into Gen X political attitudes, because not Gen X, Gen Z, that's what I meant to say. Gen Z political attitudes, because, you know, the students are into it. They love doing the research on themselves, you know, me search.
Right.
But it's also really interesting because we are finding these things that kind of go against the narrative of Gen Z being just universally liberal. But beyond that, one thing that my colleague David McClellan and I are trying to understand is this split between voting for Cooper and voting for Trump. And who are these people who voted Republican at the top of the ticket, and then for Cooper, although the race was closer than we thought it would be, Cooper still was called on election night, unlike many of our other state races. So what is it that is causing this ticket splitting in North Carolina in such a hyper-partisan era, like Chris was talking about? What is it that is it just that Cooper special and Trump is special? You know, is it a personality thing? Or is there a deeper sense of just Carolina being wacky, you know? So that's kind of one of the things that we're interested in following is what is with the ticket splitting. And we're still thinking of how to measure that. So if anyone has any ideas, I'd be all ears.
Well, and just to point out, I mean, there's a big difference between Trump, careless with COVID, and then there's Cooper, who's very careful with COVID. And we've seen some of the data all across the country that it's, you know, diametrically opposed. You care about the coronavirus, you're a Republican if that's first. Excuse me, you're a Democrat, and the economy is first if you're a Republican. And so Whitney's right, that doesn't make much sense.
Chris, any thoughts about that bipolar partisanship
Yeah,
that we're seeing in the state?
and I know you've been thinking about this a lot too, Michael, and all four of us have. The kind of this, you know, all throughout the election, I've talked about this 8 to 12%. That's exactly the folks that Susan and Whitney are talking about that are the Cooper Trump voters. I don't have any conclusions. I don't have any evidence. I sort of have this working hypothesis, which is that the North Carolina governor has very little power. It's was statutorily one of the most limited, used to be the 46th most powerful governor in the country, and then he lost some power, so now it's like 48 or 49. He can't do much. The one thing people know about Roy Cooper is that he did have some control over coronavirus. Coronavirus was a rare exception to this trend of an incredibly weak North Carolina governor. He got a ton of free media. Sure, he wasn't a Cuomo, but in the North Carolina political world, he certainly got a lot of attention. It's kind of hard to get if you're a governor. Whereas Trump, there's a whole package of issues. Like Susan talked about, there's the economy, and there is what you think about the Supreme Court. There's all these different things. So the one policy issue that people really know about Cooper is one where he actually, I think, was pretty close to the average North Carolinian. And with Trump, I think it might be a little bit more complex. So I wonder if it's part about the package of issues that North Carolina governors can actually do something about in the unique world of coronavirus and kind of people's opinions. But I want to see what you guys find out, Whitney. And obviously that's a trend, right? We, the same state that voted for Helms and voted for Hunt. So it's not new. It can't just be coronavirus. There's got to be something else going on.
Well, and how many North Carolinians know that we have such a weak governor, you know? So right. There has to be something that is going on in the minds. But I mean, according to Converse, no one has any coherent political ideology anyway, right? So,
right. And I don't think they do know, but I do think they don't know much else about Roy Cooper, right? So I think if you do ask the average North Carolinian, what's in your brain? Tell me about Roy Cooper. What are his stances? Well, you know, I think he's been, you know, a steady hand on coronavirus, I can imagine somebody saying. If you ask them about other opinions, you're right. I don't think they know much. Trump, I think they might know more. So, but I don't know. I don't know, Michael. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I was actually talking to a reporter this morning, and he was fielding calls from some viewers. This is Travis Fain at WRAL, and he was getting calls from folks saying, I don't understand how Donald Trump can win North Carolina and Roy Cooper can win North Carolina. That's not reasonable. There's got to be something going on. And, you know, as we all know, North Carolina is just infamous for split ticket voting. I reminded him of the 2004 election where North Carolina voted for George W. Bush, a Republican, by 12 percentage points. Exact same election, they vote for the Democratic incumbent governor, Mike Easley, by, wait for it, 12 percentage points. So, I mean, we've had this massive, you know, amount of Jesse Kratz down east, you know, people willing to bounce around the ticket, whatever you want to call them. But I think since 2008 and 2010, my sense is that population has shrunk considerably, and that we've still got those, and they can make the difference when we've got competitive elections like what we're seeing. Donald Trump got 2.7 million votes. Roy Cooper got 2.8. So Cooper actually performed a little bit better than the president in terms of attracting apparently cross-cutting voters in that regard. But those margins make a difference when you're talking about a competitive election environment like what we see here in North Carolina. And I think we still need to try and understand what their role is, even though their numbers are nowhere near what we saw 1980s, 1990s up to 2004.
And you overlay that with the polarization and the partisan antipathy. Yep. It becomes even more curious, except if the newbies to North Carolina, they know Trump, they thought, well, I guess things are all right. I don't know who this Cooper guy is, but I don't know the other guy. He's an incumbent, and just vote for him. But that partisan antipathy and the polarization is still there. So it's a puzzle.
And I think that's, for me, that's the big takeaway, is trying to understand that polarization that is still very apparent. I mean, we've talked about the massive turnout. Joe Biden has got, the most number of votes ever cast for president. Number 2 is Donald Trump. And, but we're still, in my mind, so deeply polarized in this competitive environment. I'm thinking about creating a class here at Catawba called The Divided Soul of America. Basically take John Meacham's book, The Soul of America, try and understand some basic ideas and principles, and then say, how did we end up in this, era of deep polarization, deep, partisanship, deep lack of trust to the other side. And I for one don't see how that in any way, shape, or form changes anytime soon. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts about it, but
if you teach that class, make sure you read Charles Koch's books.
Well, for folks just tuning in, that is probably for state level geeks like a lot of us, that has been a sore subject for a long time. And his final recognition of, gee, maybe we did push polarization a little too intensely at the state level. It's nice to be recognized at that factor. So.
Well, Michael, I might just jump in and say, if you do that course, about 4 or 5 years ago, that was kind of a cottage industry of books about the culture wars. Mm-hmm. And I think they're alive and well. And I think today makes those books look a bit antique, because you have, Trump has exacerbated that. Populism, nativism, whatever ism, the megaphone of social media. They need to add an afterword to all those books, because I think it doesn't even begin to describe the division in the country today. And Joe Biden's, I want to be president of all Americans, not just those who voted for me, empathy and unity, that's a tall order.
And I just got Robert Putnam, who I think was at Harvard, who wrote a book called Bowling Alone in the 1990s, and talked about the lack of social capital. He's got a new book out called The Uprising, in the sense of how we can get from me to us, me to we, back in terms of addressing this polarization, condition that the country is facing. I just got it today. So I haven't had a chance to dive into it, but I think pairing that along with, Susan, as you talked about, Mo Figueredo's culture wars and other things, is really something to be thinking about in that regard. Chris, how do you see? Oh, Whitney, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, in that class, make sure that you look into the social media algorithms. Yep. Because that's one thing that my students were really interested in hearing about, is how the tech industry could have probably does have a large role in how we've created these little online worlds for ourselves, where because it's a business model for them to show us things that we want to see, right?
Sure.
And things that we want to see are our, you know, our own political views related to us. And so it could be that Americans themselves didn't get, it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing. Did Americans get polarized, or did social media polarize us? Or did social media polarize us and then we became polarized? Yeah. I don't know. But it's an interesting thing to think about. And it's related to one of my own personal interests too, is just general ethics in information technology and social media, and how I could get on a soapbox about this, but about how STEM people need to learn, you know, social science as well, to think of these things and what effect that you wrote this algorithm to help you get more ad money, and what that ends up doing to Americans and American democracy.
I saw, it was on Twitter, speaking of social media, but somebody saying, you know, the STEM people really need to think about this influence of misinformation, and how do you go about checking claims, and how do you understand if information is credible or not. And part of my background is as a historian. So I come from a humanities perspective where you check your sources, you understand where the information is coming from, and you relate it in a way that you understand the context. And I'm thinking, hey, the humanities, you know, we may be dead, but we're not dead yet, kind of ideas in that regard. Chris, any thoughts on your thinking about polarization?
Along a lot of the same lines. I'm asking the same questions. I've got the Putnam book on my bedside table as well, along with a big stack of other things. But yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and I agree that those are the interesting questions. On Susan's point before about the culture wars books, a sort of cottage industry, somewhere behind me, and I'm betting, looking at Susan's shelf, it's back there too. There's a book by a political scientist, a great political scientist named Gary Jacobson, called A Divider, Not a Uniter. And the book's about George W. Bush, right? So the argument at the time was that this is the moment, this George W. Bush presidency, that's really when we made this break. And now that seems like ancient history, given what we've seen since then, right? With the polarization that's continued with Obama and with Trump. And so, you know, I think understanding that is key to understanding American politics. I think it's key to understanding why we can't pass policy in North Carolina and in many other states and nationally. I think the fact that we are such a divided state is one reason why our politics have become so divisive here. So if you're in Oklahoma, so Francis Lee, political scientist at Princeton, writes about this a lot. If you're in a state like Oklahoma where the Republicans are going to win, you know, from now until the cows come home, you don't have to act quickly. You don't have to act as aggressively. If you're in California, you're a Democrat, you got time to pass your policies. If you're in North Carolina and you're a Democrat or a Republican and you get control, you have to act right then. You have to act sharply and really move to the extreme, because you might lose your majority very soon. She calls this the insecure majorities. But I think that explains a lot of what we're seeing in American politics, and why sometimes the purplest places are the nastiest places.
Yeah. I'm going to pitch it out there, lightning round. Any final thoughts? If this may be our last blog for 2020, we'll see if we can reconvene and hopefully a better 2021. But any last thoughts on this year's election?
Well, I think a topic for 2021 is the transition and the lack thereof. And you guys teach American politics, teach the presidency. Presidential management styles and management is key to understanding. This is not just about who does Biden pick and when. It's about how you start getting not just the people, but the policies and the policy-making process. And so we're really in an uncomfortable situation about the transition. And presidents do have transition teams and plan before the fact. I don't think Donald Trump probably did, but I think, we need to look at the transition and when that should start and how much damage is being done in so many ways. That's my lightning round.
All right. Whitney, got anything?
I just wanted to say thank you to you, Michael, for bringing us together, inviting us to join you on the Old North State Politics blog. I think that you have done North Carolina a great service of sharing what we as political scientists know in an accessible way to the public, which I think is extremely valuable. And that in case, for those of you who are watching aren't in academia, it's not often recognized for us in our jobs, this kind of public facing scholarship. And so I just am really thankful that I was able to find you because I thought the same way. And we were able to, I was able to contribute a little bit to this blog that you had already created. And so I can't wait I can wait because I'm a little tired, but metaphorically, I can't wait to do this again in 2022.
I think we all need the holidays and the break and the rest, but very kind. Thank you all. Chris, any last parting thoughts?
There's no way I'm putting anything after that. I think that's well stated and a really nice way to end. So thanks. I enjoy the Gang of Four here, and I enjoy our conversations very much. So thanks to Michael and thanks to Susan and Whitney. I think I've learned a lot from you guys. It's been a mostly fun, interesting campaign season.
I will accept that qualification, mostly fun in terms of an appropriate descriptor. And again, want to thank y'all for bearing with me and being part of this this experiment in public scholarship, as Whitney so ably described it. I think it does a service for not just our students, for our communities, but I want to think more broadly, and the reactions I've been getting from some of the viewers and listeners is that indeed it is well received. So with that, we will put hopefully a wrap, unless we're hitting refresh here. I'm going to do it one more time just to kind of irritate Chris here to see
the opposite.
Where whoops, that's federal. Let's go to judicial because everybody is so interested in the state Supreme Court. So Paul Newby is back up by 300, if I can do high math here, about 350 votes. Separates him and the current Chief Justice. So that will be something to watch, certainly, as we put a wrap on this blog for the Old North State Politics. And I hope everyone has a great rest of 2020. Be careful, wear your masks, enjoy the holidays, but be socially distant. And we will see you in 2021. Thanks again.
Thanks.